Good evening, everyone. I think it's safe to say that it's been a long time since I've seen a turnout like this at a book launch. On behalf of Pan Macmillan India, I'm very pleased to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the launch of Abhishek Choudhary's magnificent debut book, Vajpayee, The Ascent of the Hindu Right. My name is Teesta Guha Sarkar. I'm the editorial director at Pan Macmillan, where I had the great pleasure of reading Abhishek's book in manuscript form last year and subsequently working with him towards its publication. At the very outset, it had become clear to me and my colleagues that we were going to bring out something momentous, not only because it was a magisterial biography of a much vaunted yet misunderstood former Prime Minister, but also because it was a shrewd investigation of the many complex factors that led to the rise of the country's right wing. So for anyone looking to read an authoritative biography of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, or if you're wishing to understand the India of today, this book is without doubt an absolutely essential read. And it is not just an illuminating work, this is also truly a complete page turner. And this isn't only my evaluation. I think readers and critics everywhere are of the very same opinion. So we couldn't be more thrilled to be launching this outstanding book today, and also with a very distinguished panel, a panel that hardly needs introduction. But for formality's sake, I am now pleased to welcome to the stage Dr. Swapan Dasgupta, former member of the Rajya Sabha and author of multiple books, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram and author of more than 20 books, Manisha Pande, Executive Editor of News Laundry, and our moderator for the evening, and last but not least, the man of the hour, Abhishek Choudhary himself. Could I now request all of you to hold up a copy of the book and launch it for our audience? Thanks, everyone. Abhishek, many congratulations. Manisha, it's over to you.
This is the first time I'm hosting a book launch, and that was rather simple. You just hold it up and it gets launched. Wow, that's a packed crowd. Thank you so much. A very good evening to all of you. Thank you so much for being with us here on a weekday. Teesta's already done the introductions, and she said that no one here needs introductions, but I do want to drive home the point that for the next 40 minutes, you're going to be listening to a very esteemed panel, all of whom have made a mark in the world of books and the written word. Swapan Dasgupta, of course, has been a journalist, a foremost columnist. He's written 2 books, the most recent of which came out in 2019, called Awakening Bharat Mata, The Political Beliefs of the Indian Right. Shashi Tharoor has written more than 20 books, 25 books? 24 books. And the most recent one came out last year, which was a biography on Ambedkar, and he's also written a short biography on Nehru. So it'll be fun to pick your brains on the form of biographies. And of course, the man of the moment, Abhishek Choudhary, who has written the book Vajpayee, The Ascent of the Hindu Right, 1924 to 1977. If you're on the internet, if you read newspapers and magazines, you can't escape being recommended this book. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that in the non-fiction space, there hasn't been a book this year that's created such a buzz. And you may have some competition because it's only June. And you may have competition from your own book because this is the first volume and the second volume comes out in December, which is going to tackle the time period of 1978 till 2018, I'm guessing, when Vajpayee passed away.
2007 or 8 to be precise.
Okay.
Yeah, after that, he had a stroke and he became vegetative. So I end in 2008 or 9, and then I'm not a huge fan of epilogue, but in the preface I'll cover 2008 up to basically the legacy and death and so on in the preface, like I have in this book.
Great. So first up, tell us why did you choose Vajpayee as the subject of your first book? This is a person who's been written about a lot. There have been 2 biographies on him that have come out over the last 5 years. We also know a lot about him through his own works, his own poems, his essays. So why Vajpayee?
Well, Manisha, the idea first came to me in 2013, and back then there were no books on Vajpayee, and it was exactly a decade ago, summer of 2013. So I was not a huge fan of biography, the genre. I always thought you write biographies to praise mostly dead people, dead men, often dead white men. कि जिसको हिंदी में there's a word called श्रद्धांजलि. In English we call it hagiography. So I did not like that genre much, and I was more interested in other kinds of non-fiction. But for the first time, I read a few very smart biographies, and that convinced me that it can be a very strong stand-alone genre in which you can use an individual's life to illuminate something larger, to talk about a society, to talk about a generation, sometimes to talk about an entire nation. And so simultaneously there was something else happening. That was also the time, if you remember, there was a succession struggle inside the BJP, and Mr. Modi was made the prime ministerial candidate, Mr. Advani was kind of sidelined, and so there was a lot of nostalgia, not among the Sangh Parivar, but among liberals about Vajpayee, about who he was, or Atal ji hote to aisa hota, wo aise nahi karte ya aisa karte. So, and that was when I started going to the archives. And I realized that the impression that I had of Vajpayee was very different from the man he had been in his early decades. And that's how the book kind of germinated. And thereafter, I also noticed a certain patterns. I noticed that, every time RSS was in trouble, like if you look at the three occasions when the RSS was banned, first in 48, during 48, 49, the second time during 75, 77, and the third time during 92, 93, he always came to the rescue. I mean, he would grumble a little bit here or there, but so there was a pattern that, he always came to defend Sangh Parivar when they needed him the most. And so that kind of pattern, so I began to see certain patterns. I began to see some of his genuine dilemmas and, some of his what I call cynical double speaks. But there was also an element of advocacy to my research. When I started researching, I realized that nothing about him written in public domain. It was very difficult to verify. Like in the early documents, his name is Atal Bihari Lal Vajpayee with a Bihari BE. Later, I never see Lal mentioned. His certificate mentions that his date of birth was 1st May 1926, whereas real date of birth is 25th December 1924, which is 25th December, which we now celebrate as Good Governance Day. Whereas he was born in Bateshwar, some of the later stories would say he was born in Gwalior. So I also wanted to fix a few basic facts because it was very confusing as a biographer. I mean, I don't think any American biographer has to face these issues when they, set out to write a presidential biography. So I thought so between those things, I thought there was enough masala, enough nuance, enough complexity to be able to, write a manuscript.
Enough for 2 volumes.
That happened later. Like we split the manuscript because it became a bit fat. And then we decided for a variety of reasons, editorial and financial, that it was better to be split. Because, it is still, one could still sell the book in English, but one would not be able to sell from a slightly obscure debutant an 800-page book in Hindi or in Marathi or in Bengali or Tamil.
And you took 7 years to research this book, right?
Well,
research and write book.
Kind of, yeah. It wasn't decided like that. I hoped I would wrap up in 2020 or 21. But it also got, obvious, like everything else on earth, it got delayed a little bit by COVID.
Shashi, in 2018, when Vajpayee passed away, you wrote a very sentimental obituary in Hindustan Times, saying that he'd be remembered for his insaniyat. And that's what set him apart. Tell us a bit about this Vajpayee that makes him different and that makes congressmen such as yourself remember him fondly today.
Well, I think there were a number of factors. One is, of course, when somebody passes away, you tend to remember the best things about them. That's part of our culture, and I don't apologize for it. It's not always the whole picture, because obviously we had many issues with many of the things that Mr. Vajpayee wrote and did. But when somebody passes away, you remember the best. And I must say that that Insaniyat point, which in fact came up as a term he used when dealing with Kashmiri separatists, was, I thought, a wonderful indication of his breadth of mind and heart. And that's why that word occurred to me. If you look at the overall, I remember this book only stops at 77 when the government is formed. It doesn't go beyond. And in many ways, what was intriguing about Abhishek's first volume is precisely that it covers the less familiar to all of us parts of Vajpayee, and certainly some of the blood-curdling things he wrote as a young man, I must say, represent the worst of Hindu majoritarianism and sectarianism in terms of both assumption, language, and treatment. And that's not the Vajpayee we've come to know since 77. And that's why it's all the more interesting and eye-opening as a book. But in terms of why Vajpayee appealed, I think, to so many people of a more liberal bent, was twofold. First of all, the manner in which he conducted his prime ministership for 6 years. And second, the contrast with which the successor BJP government some years later has behaved. I mean, there's such a big difference that in many ways Mr. Vajpayee looks so much better by comparison. Now you can turn around and say, well, that was a coalition government, this is not. Here people are freer to be themselves, whereas Mr. Vajpayee had to temper perhaps some of his more strong beliefs in order to accommodate. I think he had 26 parties in his coalition, of which 24 did not subscribe to Hindutva. You just had him and the Shiv Sena subscribing to that. So in those circumstances, perhaps he had to be a conciliator, but I think there was something of the temperament of a conciliator that came across. And that goes all the way back to his ascension to office in 1977, that famous anecdote of how when he first became foreign minister and came to that office in South Block, he discovered that the photograph of Nehru, which had been kept behind the foreign minister's desk, had disappeared. And he asked what happened to it. And he said, we removed it, we assumed you wouldn't want it here, sir. And he said, bring it back immediately. This is the legacy that I'm proud to inherit. Now that kind of anecdote, I don't know if the exact words are what he said, but nonetheless, it reflects a certain kind of sensibility and temperament, which is far removed from what we see from BJP people in power today. So to that degree, you can understand why there is a certain regard and affection that some of Mr. Vajpayee's political opponents would feel looking at him.
We have a BJP person in power here. What did you think of the book? You have to tell us first,
No,
because
firstly,
I think
let me get to, we've heard various assessments of Vajpayee. A Vajpayee I'm not very familiar with, because he was my boyhood hero.
You were telling us that you'd go to speeches to listen.
Yeah, I remember first going to listen to him when I was about 14 years old, because his oratory was so mesmerizing. And there was a certain legend about his oratory which was known, that regardless of what you believed or you didn't believe, people just went there to just hear him. And that oratory, which I fear that when he became prime minister, we didn't see that, the real power of his oratory at that time. And in those days, Parliament was never broadcast live. It was, you got sort of potted versions from newspapers. But those who are familiar with Vajpayee's Bhiwani speech, for instance, in 1970, it had a very important effect. So Vajpayee, in any case, when you talk about so-called Indian right, it didn't mean Meenu Masani. It didn't mean Rajaji, although Rajaji was a cult figure at one time. It meant Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So when Atal Bihari Vajpayee became prime minister subsequently, he epitomized all those emotions, those impulses which had built up steadily from about the 50s. I can't talk about the 50s, I can only talk about the 60s. But there was a feeling of nationalism which was not exclusive to the Janasangh at that time. But from the late 1960s, once the Congress turned sharply to the left under the influence of the Communist Party, I think people like Vajpayee became more and more relevant. I don't see Vajpayee as a liberal. I think Vajpayee was a conservative, in a very traditional conservative sense. His values, his reactions were very much that of a traditionalist, where I think people make the mistake of believing that just because Vajpayee often was sort of ambivalent about what he believed in, at least to the outside world, that he didn't have any strong convictions. But I think Abhishek was right in saying that whenever it came to the crunch, I don't think Vajpayee ever wavered. So there is an Atal Bihari Vajpayee which exists in the imagination of those who were orphaned by the demise of the Congress and who clung on to Vajpayee as some sort of a solace of the old ancien regime. But there is another Vajpayee, for us, the believers, let's put it this way, who meant something very, very different. Yes, of course, we criticized him sometimes. Yes, we got exasperated by him. We wanted a faster pace. These were factors, yes, undeniably so. But at the end of the day, I recognize more of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee in Abhishek's book than I do in some of the other attempted biographies of the person.
That's a great compliment.
In fact, though, it is interesting that I think Abhishek quotes Acharya Kriplani as saying in 1962 that Vajpayee is actually a Nehruvian in Jansanghi garb. So there was, even in those early days, which is the ground covered in this volume, there was a perception that there was something else to him than just the conservative that Swapan described.
The conservatives are not some sort of flat earth society people.
We shouldn't
generalize from you, Swapan.
So actually, Abhishek, the first part of your book, The Hindu Soul Ripens, precisely deals with Vajpayee's early writings, what Shashi Tharoor was talking about, and also what Swapan says that he was really shaping the Hindu right-wing thought. Tell us a bit about these early writings, and how did that shape his political thought?
Well, look, given his background, so there are two things to consider. A, his background, where he came from, and B, the choices that he made. So both have to be considered in totality. So Vajpayee's grandfather and all the, all his predecessors before that, they went to Banaras. Like many Brahmins in different parts of the country, like many privileged Brahmins who could afford, they went to Banaras to study Sanskrit and scriptures, and they came back home, like his grandfather came back home to his village, hoping to earn his livelihood as a priest. But he had no great idea of wider association. So most of his life was limited, doing some Janev Sanskar or doing some Gita Vach, mostly for fellow Brahmins. But the radical break came with his father's generation. Like instead of going to Banaras to study Sanskrit or scriptures, he decided to go to Agra to teach himself English. And that was also the time he got associated with Arya Samaj. And that's how he got introduced to the broader ideas of what we now call nationhood, citizenship, patriotism. And the idea of Hindu victimhood first came to him, to Mr. Vajpayee's father. And thereafter, he went to Gwalior, and I've also written in details about the Gwalior of the 40s and how it was in many ways a self-contained Hindutva republic towards the end of the 30s. And Vajpayee basically imbibed all of that, his surroundings, and of course, the Arya Samaj version of history that he was reading at home. And which is what, if you read the early poems, and I mean, at age 13, I was basically playing either video game or watching Cartoon Network. But Mr. Vajpayee at age 14 was writing a poem on Taj Mahal and talking about Hindu victimhood, how Hindu workers were exploited in the construction of Taj Mahal. And at 17, he wrote that poem, Hindu Tanman. I would actually want to read two lines from
which Swapan told us before that he loved narrating it again.
Right. He was, I mean, it became his most popular, it remains his most popular poem. गोपाल राम के नामों पर कब मैंने अत्याचार किए, कब दुनिया को हिंदू करने घर घर में नरसंहार किए, कोई बतलाए काबुल में जाकर कितनी तोड़ी मस्जिदें, भूभाग नहीं शत शत मानव के हृदय जीतने का निश्चय, Hindu Tanman, Hindu Jivan, Rag Rag, Hindu Mera Parichay. So he was writing this at age 17. So he became politicized at a much younger age. So but that was part of it was his background. But also the choices he made in the summer of 46 and then in 47, like anyone else in his generation, he could have finished his studies and got a job, got a lectureship. But he did not. He decided, I mean, of course, the politics was something else in the background, like Hindu Mahasabha did very badly in the 45 election, Muslim League did well, and beyond a point, people knew that partition almost looked like a certainty. And it was in that environment that he first decided to become a pracharak first. And he failed because he was physically slightly frail. And then the right moment, opportunity arrived in 47 when he was offered to become editor of Rashdharm. And that's how he became a full timer of the RSS. And from there again, you also mentioned, and like anybody who's read the book can flip through the early writings and see that he was like his tone is very different from the Vajpayee we know of the later decades. And thereafter, a crucial point here is also that after Gandhi's assassination, many Sangh sympathizers and active workers actually deserted the Sangh Parivar because the ban was very harsh. Nehru was very keen to punish them. But Vajpayee did not. He did not go back home. He led the underground, first in Allahabad and then in Banaras. He floated magazines. Of course, I mean, they did not, they couldn't do much. But even then, the crucial point is that he got noticed at that crucial moment.
Because he stuck around.
Yes, he stuck around. And at the most vulnerable moment, and that's where his actual ascent began. And thereafter, he started addressing first the RSS crowd all across UP. Thereafter, he kind of became a mini celebrity already in the RSS circles. But it was still far from certain that he would become a full-time politician. I think that happened in 53 and after Syama Prasad Mukherjee's death, because they did not have too many faces left. And even though he was very, very young, I mean, Deen Dayal Upadhyay saw potential in him. And that's how he was inducted into, I mean, it's a myth that he was a founding member of Jan Sangh. Like he was inducted much later, 2 years later. And soon after, after Vijaya Lakshmi was sent as UK to the High Commissioner, that Lucknow seat became vacant. And that's how he fought his first election. And even though he did badly, he stood third, he got 28% votes. So inside the Sangh Parivar, he kept his popularity, kept shooting up. And finally, in 57, he became MP. And then soon after, in 59, I think he became a national celebrity after he attacked Nehru on the China question and managed to get a white paper out of him. So that's his journey from 1938 when he wrote that Taj Mahal poem to 59 when he became a celebrity MP. Yeah.
So the period that he's talking about, Shashi, it's actually very interesting. His book details this dichotomy within the Congress where Nehru's, this is before the assassination, before Gandhi's assassination, he's very keen on banning RSS. He's very clear in his head that this is an organization that, he's appalled by their activities. He says, they're as bad as Jinnah's thugs. Meanwhile, Patel, you can see, is more sympathetic. He argues that, ban is not the way. And he believes that he can also get their help in certain projects. What do you make of this dichotomy? And like Abhishek mentions in his book that back then actually some of the conservative members of Congress could have more in common with the BJP today. So how do you see this Patel versus Nehru on RSS?
That was true earlier too. In fact, I mean, one of the interesting things about this book, there are many interesting things, and it certainly is a rewarding read for those of us who aren't aware of that period as much. Certainly we're not aware of the younger Vajpayee. But it's also a fascinating political history of that period. And if you were to look at Abhishek's description of the whole question that Manisha has raised, the RSS, Nehru, Patel, and so on, there is a clear cleavage. And it's partly because we shouldn't confound the RSS with the Hindu Mahasabha, which was the Hindu majoritarian organization. The RSS was still open to a slightly more, accommodative, I suppose would be the word, not liberal, but a slightly more accommodative politics. They were willing to engage with congressmen. They wanted to have some role in government. There were all sorts of things we were thinking about. And I think there was a period of time, Abhishek can tell us how many years you would describe that bracketed period, when there were many in the RSS who were quite prepared to cooperate with the Congress and even join the Congress, and many in the Congress who were quite prepared to cooperate with the RSS. And it's interesting because the RSS had emerged from many people who were actually bigwigs in the Hindu Mahasabha.
Right.
Munje, for example. Munje went to Italy, saw the Mussolini fascist training and so on, and came back and advised Hegdegar, this is what you should do. The RSS shakhas learned their tricks of the trade, as it were, and their practices from Munje. Munje was president of Hindu Mahasabha for 10 years, but was also a founding member of the RSS. So you've got, it's a very interesting, slightly confusing period where allegiances were not just black and white, were somewhat fluid. Don't forget, just for the late 20s, you had congressmen who were also Muslim Leaguers.
Right.
So having,
And Mahasabhites too.
And Mahasabhites too.
Right.
So yeah, people like Madan Mohan Malviya had certain sympathies. Patel was a traditionalist. I think the main difference that people don't fully appreciate when understanding Patel's conservatism is that he was, at bottom, rock-hard Gandhian. And because of that Gandhianism, his conservatism never tipped over into the RSS side of things. He was sympathetic to the RSS in that he felt they could be useful for India. He encouraged the RSS to be supportive. I think there were a couple of issues at the time of the merger of states and so on, when the RSS, for example, wanted to be active in Kashmir, and Patel said, don't come right now, but be prepared, we might need you. Yeah. That kind of thing, So you had a lot of stuff going on, and Patel was certainly not inimical to the RSS. But the assassination of Gandhiji was for him unforgivable. Even though Godse had left the RSS, he was still a serving member of the Hindu Mahasabha, but he'd left the RSS. Nonetheless, Patel felt that RSS had created an atmosphere that enabled the assassination. And that's where he simply could, he went ahead with a ban, which, as Abhishek points out, was rather unimaginatively enforced. It was kind of a blanket ban. Anybody who was on any RSS role,
even minors
including minors, were put in jail. And so the whole thing was a bit of a mess. But the point is that if you want to look at this to give fodder to the Patel versus Nehru debate that some in the current ruling establishment have been provoking, I don't think actually this gives that much satisfaction to it, because at the end of the day, where Patel came more on the Congress side was in his Gandhianism. And the RSS's opposition to, indeed, hatred of Gandhi was something that he could never abide beyond a point. He had no fundamental issue with the RSS speaking for Hindu interests at a time when the country was going through savagery of a communal nature. So that is true, and Nehru was very different in that regard. Nehru would not have abided the notion that Patel was prepared to entertain, that the RSS was actually standing up for Hindu interests at a difficult time. But Patel is not a closet Jansanghi. I mean, he was certainly very, very clearly somebody who was in the Gandhian mainstream, stayed fundamentally anchored in the Congress. But yes, I think he was certainly more accommodative, or would have been more prepared to accept RSS involvement until the assassination.
Would you agree with that?
Well, yes and no. I think the interesting thing about the RSS was that ever since Guru Golwalkar took over the control of the organization, the RSS had a particularly profound distaste of politics. Guru Golwalkar used to often say that politics is like the toilet in a house. It's inescapable, but it's not a desirable place to visit. We're talking about the old days when toilets were, what they were. But he did not really encourage the best and the brightest of the swayamsevaks to ever participate in politics. What really changed to a very large extent was the ban, or the 48 ban. After the 48 ban, a large number of the RSS people felt that to prevent a recurrence of this, they should have a certain say in the political world. And Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who was not by any means an RSS person, he was more in the Hindu Mahasabha trend. And he exactly epitomized what you say, the interchangeability between the Mahasabha and the Congress. He was the archetypal Bengali conservative. Representing Hindu interests, but who you would probably say is not the same as Savarkar. But they had a meeting of minds with Savarkar at that time. Now, I think the problem really arose when the Congress started throwing out the conservatives from within their ranks. And I think the Congress split of 1969 was more responsible for that. Till then, the Congress was the big grand umbrella where both tendencies could easily be accommodated. And I think after 69, and I still blame the Communist Party of India for its pivotal role. I mean, the Communist Party, they have never played a direct role. They've always played a very subversive role in thing. The CPI influence within the Congress led to all those people more or less exiting Congress and looking for alternatives. And the only alternative they could find at that point was either the Jansangh and soon the BJP.
Jansangh or the Swatantra.
Swatantra at that time, but remember Swatantra made this cardinal blunder in 1960, in 1970, whatever it was, 2 or 3, of merging itself with Charan Singh, which was, I think, not a very good move on their part.
74, I think it was.
I think it was 74.
Yeah.
So the battle of the conservatives and the liberals within the Congress was really not settled by people like Atal Bihari Vajpayee. They were perhaps passive recipients of a phenomena which took place somewhere else.
But Swapan, there was still a difference between the Congress traditionalists and the RSS Hindu Mahasabha types within the Congress.
Of course, yes.
I mean, that was on the issue of independence. You know, some people even trace the origins of the Jansangh all the way back to Tilak. But Tilak was staunchly for fighting against the British and throwing them out of the country. And the same with all these people, including Patel, whereas the RSS said, no, we should fight for Hindu interests. And if that means cooperating with the British, we will cooperate. That's a very big distinction.
I think when you say cooperate with the British, I think 1942 is the really point which everyone talks about. Remember one thing, Quit India movement.
Was with the Quit India
in hindsight today,
in
hindsight today, the Quit India movement has been glorified. But the Quit India movement was the least successful of all the Gandhian movements. Everyone, because it was probably the one movement which had important flashpoints. I mean, there was Satara, Midnapur, Balia, all these places were important flashpoints. But by and large, that was a movement which petered out by the end of 1942.
They were all in jail.
They were all in jail. They were all in jail. And the idea that you should, you know, at this point, leave India to God and anarchy, Gandhi's very famous thing, was not taken very, very seriously. So when people talk about the lineage of the Jansangh, they're talking about an ideological current. And that's a current which you can actually trace back to the inspiration of Shivaji also. But that's a looser formulation. That's not real organizational structure. That's really in terms of the mind, in terms of where you trace somebody's lineage.
Back to Vajpayee. You have a very clear-eyed chapter on Vajpayee's personal life with his partner, and you talk about his love child, and most biographers have shied away from talking about this. And especially in a country where we want to see politicians, you know, we put them on a pedestal, we don't want to see them as real human beings. We attribute to them qualities that we may not have necessarily in our own personal lives. And we don't want to understand that politicians can also have complex personal lives. Why did you choose to have a chapter on that? You could have easily skipped past it like others have. It's also the most talked about. Unfortunately, it's getting more eyeballs than the rest of the stuff.
Well, Samuel Johnson once said that, to come back to a happy home is the final result of all ambition. So
it's a beautiful quote.
Any self-respecting biographer, every self-respecting biographer will have to write something about the private life. And honestly, Manisha, I have not made any new revelations except perhaps to say that he had a biological daughter. And I also did that partly because, had I written this book 20 years ago, I may not have mentioned. I did that partly because all the most of the principal characters in the story are they are dead, but also because they were lifelong partners. And when Mr. Vajpayee passed away, the daughter did the last riots, and it was done in front of the national TV, so everybody already saw it. So I don't think I said something all that radically new. And in any case, it's 10-15 pages in an 800-page manuscript. and that's like 1% or 2%. So not writing that would be very dishonest. It would, I try to write about it in a very detached, in a very unsentimental way. I have given enough agency to all the principal characters, and even though that was not the intention, I think all of them come out looking rather very good. Yeah, that's what I hear.
That's what you hear. Okay, well, I think we're going to throw up this discussion to the audience, but I just have two quick questions. I think one from Shashi Tharoor, because you've written 2 biographies. The art of writing a biography, and you've also written it on 2 very revered figures, Ambedkar and Nehru. How is it different from other non-fiction work, and what are the things you have to be careful about? Because you're writing about people who are, the little gods.
No, I must say that I never attempted what Abhishek has attempted. In other words, I didn't have the time as somebody with another profession, another life, to delve very deeply into primary sources. In the case of both Nehru and Ambedkar, I read pretty much everything. I can't say that of Ambedkar because he is prolific like you wouldn't believe he was. But I read as much as possible, let's say, of what the two themselves wrote and published and what they spoke in speeches that have been recorded and circulated. And so I had a pretty decent insight into their minds and at least what they wanted to convey to the world of their minds. And I read secondary sources, especially the few authoritative biographies that existed on both people. And thereafter, my task in both cases was to write something short, a distilled short biography for the TikTok generation, as we call them today, of people who wouldn't perhaps pile into an 800-page manuscript. And there are some very, very, obviously, if you want to really delve into Nehru's life, you can't do better than Sarvapalli Gopal. But if you don't have time for 12 volumes and God knows how many thousand pages, then yeah, you can get mine for 200 pages and finish it off on a short airline flight. And the same with Ambedkar. I'm not making any pretenses about that. What I hoped was distinctive about the books was I told the stories of their lives sufficiently comprehensively that nothing major was omitted. And at the same time, I attempted to distill an appreciation of the legacy of each man. The Nehru book was written, in fact, when the Vajpayee government was in power. And as a result, he was being challenged and questioned and discredited for the first time. And I thought it was necessary at that point to look at the man whole. Flaws and all. And Ambedkar has been written, in fact, it was written exactly, he died at the age of 65, and I started writing exactly 65 years later to see this extraordinary figure whose stature had grown so remarkably since his death. Whereas, if you like, the Nehru sort of reputational graph has been coming down since his death, Ambedkar's has shot up. And a man who lost more elections than he won, who had as many enemies and critics as admirers, is today an unchallengeable, revered figure, and it was worth understanding why and what his contribution was, and attempting also to see him whole. And in both cases, I was interested as much in their thoughts and ideas as in their lives. I think what Abhishek has done is remarkable. He's gone into a lot of primary sources, and he's dug up things. I mean, this business of looking up birth certificates, not birth certificates, but school certificates and other records to cast, mystery. All of us, even when Vajpayee Sahib died, I think we all assumed it was December 25, 1926, but our friend Abhishek tells us it was 24. The school has him as 1 May 1926, which is even different. And that's even more peculiar, Abhishek, because normally parents try to increase the age of their children to get them into school quickly. Why did Vajpayee get a younger age?
No, it's a peculiarly Hindi heartland thing.
Achha.
So they could get, government jobs, they could apply to... No.
They would retire later. Good point. They would retire later from a government job if they were made younger than they really were. Quite right. Because normally when you turn about 55, 56, that's when most Sarkari Babus start realizing that their birth certificate was wrong. That's when the
Swapan, before we began this talk, Abhishek and I were discussing that the next biography on Atal Bihari Vajpayee should be written by you. Because you have this insider-outsider kind of... you've reported on him as a journalist, you've known him also. I guess my question to you would be, are we going to get that biography? And two, what are some of the most misunderstood things about Vajpayee, according to you?
Okay. No, you won't get the biography in that form, at least not for some time.
Okay, then give us some anecdotes.
You are privy to a lot of confidences which are told to you, and those are based on trust. I don't believe that somehow the time has come when many things which they said which they wouldn't like to own up to now, which it would be tantamount to a kiss and tell. It's not something I would like. So at least for the moment, well, maybe when in another 10 years, when most of the actors are not there anymore, maybe. So for the moment. Now, what about Vajpayee, which has been misunderstood most? I think what has been misunderstood is, what I find is the remaking of Vajpayee after he became Prime Minister. There was a Vajpayee we knew. There was a Vajpayee you remember, for some of us here who may not be that old. You remember the Vajpayee of the 13-day government. You remember the Vajpayee who made that spectacular speech. But after that, another Vajpayee was somehow recast. And I feel that today, this book helps in a very important way to actually recover the Vajpayee who we had thought had been lost or somehow been transformed into history. I mean, I think it happens to a lot of individuals. You know, Ambedkar is a classic example of that. Ambedkar was a middling figure in the Indian pantheon, in the political pantheon, till about the 1980s. Then suddenly he became something else. His influence was posthumous, almost entirely. So this is not something which is unique to Atal Bihari Vajpayee. I believe Jawaharlal Nehru also, in a way, has been recast subsequently. And it's inevitable, it's bound to happen. You know, because people's biographies, people's perceptions are made by are shaped by contemporary events, not about what they were when they existed. So to that extent, I think, thank you, Abhishek, for restoring Vajpayee to the Hindu fold.
And I think on Ambedkar, you
looking
disagree.
forward to the second volume. I mean, that's certainly the Vajpayee most of us are more familiar with. I've met that Vajpayee. I haven't met either Nehru or Ambedkar, but I did meet Vajpayee. And I'm going to be fascinated to see how Abhishek, with his meticulous research, uncovers the complexities of the man, because there were.
But the point is, did you hear Vajpayee in the old days?
Well, I mean,
even hear his speech in 1977 when they came out of jail. I mean, I think some vague YouTube thing still has it somewhere or the other. It's worth hearing some of his earlier speeches. And if you can get a recording, and I don't know if you've managed to track down any recording of his speeches, they are something else. That's poetry.
I've read accounts, but I've not.
Yeah, but it's worth looking at it purely from a historical point of view.
His famous speech in '77 when he was campaigning for the Janata government, saying, "You've given us a kurta, now give us the pajamas." That is asking for the state governments, saying, it's time to vote us into state governments as well, that kind of thing. He certainly, and the famous speech, as you said, when the 13-day government was voted out. But I met, unfortunately, the declining Vajpayee. I met Vajpayee when he became Prime Minister and came to the UN, where as a senior Indian I had an opportunity to spend 15 minutes with him every year before he went off to speak at the Assembly. And that had already got to the stage when his pauses were longer than his sentences.
Yeah.
And that, I'm afraid, is sort of my own personal recollection, which is why I'm looking forward to the second volume, to see the fuller picture.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We're absolutely out of time. Can't take any more questions. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great evening.